week's Parsha. It's actually something that we did a few years back. I'm revisiting it, maybe adding a little bit, changing things, but basically it's one of the many mitzvot. Now we hit the section of Sefer Vayikra and Achrimot Kedoshim, where the mitzvah components of the Sefer are more intense. This will continue through Parshat Bahar, a little bit less in Bechukotai, and the emphasis, as opposed to the beginning of Sefer Vayikra, is not on the korbanot and not on the Mishkan, but on more general mitzvot and mitzvot that apply in all sorts of circumstances. The mitzvah specifically that I'm going to be speaking about are mitzvot of lo tikom and lo titor, not to take revenge, nor to bear a grudge, and we're going to talk about them specifically. However, it's important to note that they are found at the beginning of Parshat Kedoshim, and in Parshat Kedoshim, the Torah is giving us this list of mitzvot, and in a certain way, it's bringing us back to Sinai. I'm going to go a little bit out of order in terms of the Makorot here, and focus on this on number 2. We'll come back to number 1 in just one moment. That just a snippet of it. It's a midrash in Vayikra Rabbah, but it's an idea which is spoken about quite a lot. Rabbi Levi Amar, Mipnei she'aseret hadibrot klulin b'tocha. Why is this, the question that's being asked is, why is this called Parshat Kedoshim? What is the kedusha that's involved? And the answer that Rabbi Levi gives is that the aseret hadibrot are included in it. Anochi Hashem Elokecha u'ktivhacha ani Hashem Elokechem. What's the here we have this statement of Ani Hashem Elokechem, and that is parallel to what we are familiar with in the first of the Dibrot of Anochi Hashem Elokecha. And then the Midrash in the part that I have deleted here is edited out, is basically goes mitzvah by mitzvah, trying to show the parallel and the comparisons. And it's not just parallel and comparisons, it's also a deepening of the concepts of the Aseret HaDibrot as they are found there, with the way that they are reflected on perhaps a slightly, or more than slightly, more sophisticated level at times in Parshat Kedoshim. So here, though, we continue, lo tignov, ktivhacha lo tignovu v'lo tichachashu. Do not steal, nor should you deny, and in other words, deny a legitimate claim that a person might have against you. That's also a form of stealing. Lo ta'aneh et reyacha. So just there's a good example of where you can see how Parshat Kedoshim is not just parroting the Aseret HaDibrot, but deepening and broadening simultaneously the construct. Lo ta'aneh b'reyacha et shaker. So you have this idea, which is more specific to the courts, that you should not bear false witness against your fellow person. Uchtivhacha lo telech rachil ba'amecha. And here in Parshat Kedoshim, the parallel is not to be a talebearer, not to speak lashon hara, etc. So, and rechilut might be false testimony. Rechilut might also be true testimony. In other words, it's not testimony in the sense of in being in the court. It's chit chat between people, but that is also an expansion of the idea of the Aseret HaDibrot of lo ta'aneh v'reyacha et shaker. Right? So that is a good example of how the Midrash is not simply saying that Parshat Kedoshim is a retelling of the Aseret HaDibrot, but it's a reframing of the Aseret HaDibrot in order to make it all the more profound and deeper. Finally, in our case, lo tachmod b'ktiv hacha v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. So you have the isur of lo tachmod, of not to covet, right? Which we've spoken about at different times in terms of what is the expectation of not coveting. We might touch upon it a little bit here as well, but we have the much broader idea of not simply not wanting to receive something which doesn't, or to take something which doesn't belong to me, but also to love my neighbor as myself. The golden rule, etc. So this is the framework that the beginning of Parshat Kedoshim, at least from this Midrash's viewpoint, is. It's basically saying, take the most basic core of the Torah, the Aseret HaDibrot. After all, that is what was told to us directly at Sinai. That is what is inscribed on the Aseret HaDibrot. That's what's inside the Aron HaEdut, inside the Aron HaKodesh, inside the Beit HaMikdash. That's the core, and expand it to Kedoshim, to you, that you have to be Kadosh. These concepts don't belong just inside the Mikdash, where we can give it lip service. They are these are tenets that you're supposed to be actively engaging and actively expressing. Within the context of Ahavta l'reacha kamocha, so let's go back to Lo Taqom and Lo Tטור. Okay, not to take revenge and not to bear a grudge. Here, there are two psukim, Perek Yutet, psukim Yud Zayin and Yud Chet, and the Torah says, Lo tisnat achicha bilvavecha, hocheach tochiach et amitecha, lo tisa alav chet. So the first pasuk is, do not hate your brother in your heart. Hocheach tochiach et amitecha, confront and castigate your fellow person. Lo tisa alav chet, and do not bear a sin against him. Lo tikom v'lo tטור, do not take revenge. Do not bear a grudge at bnei amecha. V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha ani Hashem, and to love your neighbor as yourself. Now, if you take a look, this is just an aside, but here in these two psukim, the Torah uses different terms, right? Achicha, right? You have that your brother. You have amitecha. You have your fellow person. You have bnei amecha, right? People of your brothers of the, or not brothers, excuse me, the members of your nation, and l'reacha, right? Your neighbor or your fellow. Within the context, the Torah is using different terms to describe the relationship. Now, you could begin to parse this and say, oh, is there a difference between achicha? Is there a difference between achicha and amitecha, between amitecha and bnei amecha, between bnei amecha l'reacha? For my purposes right now, I'm going to assume that they're basically the same idea, but that the Torah is, perhaps for literary reasons, perhaps for to give an expression of different kinds of relationships that people have, that we have this idea of that's going on in terms of the different types of people, different types of relationships. The Ramban was sensitive, though, not to as much to the noun that's involved in the subject of the object, I should say, of achicha, amitecha, bnei amecha, and reacha, but rather to the subject, the person who is being commanded, and the actions that he is supposed to be taking or not to be taking. And he basically says that the idea here of lo tisnat achicha bilvavecha is there is a progression that's involved. Lo tisnat achicha bilvavecha, right? Well, let's read the Ramban inside. Yomar HaKatuv, al tisna et achicha bilvavecha, ba'asota lecha shelo kirtzoncha. In other words, we begin with a interaction between two human beings. And there's a reason why I might want to hate a person, bilvavi. Why would I want to hate? Where are we talking about, what we would classically call sinat chinam, something that, that we're dealing with people who are just simply that, for no reason whatsoever, baseless hatred? No, presumably the reason why I might be hating someone is because he's wronged me in some kind of way. So this person has hurt me. So don't hold it in your heart, the Ramban says. Al tisnat achicha bilvavecha, specifically in your heart. Don't do that, but rather, tochichenu madua kacha asita imadi. Confront the person. Ask him, why did you do this to me? In other words, what the Ramban is saying, it's very perhaps obvious, but at the same time, very deep psychological insight. If the best way to diffuse a confrontation, to diffuse tension between two people, is for the person who feels that he's been wronged or she's been wronged to confront the other individual in an open way and not to hold it in. Right? Normally we say, okay, just let it slide. And the Ramban is saying that the Torah is saying, don't let it slide in that regard, but rather be open and to be confronting. Now, normally speaking, when we talk about tochacha, and perhaps for another shir, I'll focus on this idea of hocheach tochiach et amitecha. What does it mean to confront another person? Normally speaking, we talk about tochacha, and we certainly in yeshiva circles, we think of it in the sense of religiosity. You see a person doing something which is religiously problematic, and you have an obligation to put him on the straight and narrow. So that is what is an outgrowth, the Ramban would say, of hocheach tochiach. There's just as an aside, there's a famous quip by Rav Yisrael Salanter that he said that generally speaking, people are very makbid about their own olam hazeh and other people's olam haba. Right? And if we were to be able to flip that and care more about other people's olam hazeh and our own olam haba, the world would be a much better place. Okay? So that's the tochacha. But the Ramban is saying the tochacha here is not the tochacha that, as I said, you see somebody who is being mechalal Shabbat and you try to talk to them about how they should be better Sabbath observers. No, tochichenu here is interpersonal. And you are, that's the pshat. It's in the context of lo tisnat achicha bilvavecha, confront the other person, and then lo tisa alav chet l'chasot sinato bilibecha v'lo tagidlo. Because if you are able to open up the discussion and you can have an interpersonal relationship with that other person, so then you might find that there really isn't a cause for the enmity in the first place. If you go over to that person, she might apologize. Or alternatively, they'll admit their fault. You'll realize perhaps that what you thought was a slight wasn't a slight and wasn't intentional, and we'll be able to get on with our lives, because otherwise you have this idea of lo tisal av chet. If I don't go and speak to that person, so then I will be holding it in, and I will bear it against him, not necessarily doing anything against her, but I'll feel it in my heart. That's the lo tisa alav chet. Then acharei chen, after we've had this opening pasuk of how to diffuse a situation, as it were. Acharei chen yazhir shelo tinkom mimenu v'lo titor bilvavcha ma she'asa lecha. Okay, the Torah then goes and adds the next step in saying, and don't take some kind of action, some kind of revenge or a grudge against what he did. Ki tachen shelo yisna oto, aval yiskor achet b'libo. In other words, there are different levels of strained relationships. If someone has slighted me in some kind of way, so I might not hate him. Hate is a very strong word. Enmity is a very strong word. I won't really like him either. And when that person asks for a favor in some kind of way, so then I won't be willing or open to helping them out. I don't hate him. I don't hate her, God forbid, right? Lo tisna achicha bilvavecha. I would never dream of hating another person. But that doesn't mean that I'm their best friend either. And when people aren't best friends, so then they might not do favors for each other. They might have these little petty type of tit for tats. That's what the Ramban says is the context on the pshat level of lo tikom v'lo titor here. The idea being acharei chen yazhir shelo tinkom v'lo titor ma she'asa lecha. However, lefikach yazhirenu she'imcha pesha achav v'chatato milibo. Right. That's why you should be erasing it entirely from your heart. And after that, you can reach the level of v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Once you have done that, so then you can say, okay, v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, ani Hashem, right? This is the goal. In other words, we started with lo tisnat achicha bilvavecha. We started with the negative. Don't hate your brother in your heart. And we've ended with v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, right? To love him. And and of course, ahava is not only the opposite of sinah, but it's also the focus of livavcha. Here in this context, lo tisnat achicha bilvavecha is that you are not necessarily expressing it. It's something which is hidden. But ahava l'reacha kamocha, so love is something which is of the heart, and it is, if I'm doing it kamocha, right? So then it's implying that it's going in the opposite direction. I'm taking it from my heart, and I am applying it and in ways where there is an active expression of my love. Now, the Ramban takes this one step further. Again, this is just not just, but if you will, the philosophical underpinning of what I want to talk about on the halachic side. The Ramban takes this one step further, and he says, Vitam, a very important Ramban, even though I didn't put it in bold here, but it's a classic Ramban. Tam v'ahavta l'reyacha kamocha, right? The Ramban is focusing on that lamed, right? L'reyacha kamocha, to your fellow, as yourself. So it doesn't say v'ahavta et reyacha, that you should, we would expect it not to be ahava le, but ahava et, lehov et, right? Ani ohev otcha, right? I love you. So it's an et, it's not a le. Why is it a lireyecha kamocha? So the Ramban says haflaga. This is an exaggeration. What we would say hagzama in modern Hebrew. Ki lo yikabel lev ha'adam sheyov et chavero ka'avato et nafsha. The Ramban says that it is impossible, or perhaps virtually impossible, to love another person as much as I love myself. My self-interest is genetically hardwired into our systems, and that element of that egotistical nature is something which is so innate that it is virtually impossible to reach a point where I can actually say, "V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha." And the truth is, the Ramban says that halachically we don't say this. We say we're aware of the rabbinic dictum that Rabbi Akiva had stated, "Chayecha kodmin l'chayei chavercha." Right? That normally speaking, and there might be some exceptions to this, but normally speaking, we say that a person, if I have to choose between saving my own life and saving someone else's, so the default position in halacha is that my life comes first. Ella, so then what does this mean? The Ramban says, mitzvat Torah she'ov chavero b'chol inyan kasher yohav et nafsho b'chol atov. What I'm trying to do is to reach the point that I look at this other person and I love her as much as I do myself, but it's a quest. That's why it's lireacha. It's almost a Zeno's paradox in terms of I keep getting a little closer, a little closer, a little closer. And I never quite reach it, okay? Because perhaps it's impossible to reach. That's the idea here. But it's all started with lo tisnat achicha bilvavecha. It all started with this this idea that someone slighted me. How do I respond? And if I respond correctly, I can reach the point or come very close to the point of v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. That is the ultimate goal, right? That's the getting back to the midrash that we started with. That's the end of the Aseret HaDibrot. Right? If the Aseret HaDibrot were, on the one hand, I begin with Anochi Hashem Elokecha, and then you say, well, for what purpose? So the end goal is lo tachmod. The end goal is that I reach this point where I look at other people's their possessions, and I don't have any sense of jealousy, and I don't covet them in any way. I don't desire them in any way. That is an end goal. Similarly, v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha is an end goal. It's something which is incredibly difficult to achieve. It takes perhaps a lifetime of work to achieve. One never quite reaches that final goal, right? If you think that you've reached it, you probably are further away than you were the moment before you thought it. And but still, that is the goal. It starts with I shouldn't say not such a difficult expectation, because it's difficult in its own right if someone has harmed me in some way, of lo tisnat achicha bilvavecha, but it reaches that positive aspect of v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. I might come back to a parallel to the lo tachmod. I'm going to skip number 3 right now. I want to, that is where the Rambam talks about, just to give you a sense, the Rambam, and we've spoken about this another shiurim much more at length and in depth. Now, when we talk about lo tachmod itself has this higher spiritual value that I just mentioned, but at the same time, there are clearly defined halachic guidelines to what is allowed and what's not, what is within the context of the Isser, because there's an understanding or a realization that that we can't necessarily get to the highest level what is considered to be acceptable, what's not considered to be acceptable. So that's with regard to lo tachmod. I'm going to leave it aside for the moment because I don't want to take too much time in that direction. I want to stay within my allotted time. Maybe we'll come back to it, or maybe we'll save it for a different time. I want to look at at number 4. Here in number 4, the Rambam in Hilchot Deot, and it's important that we note where the Rambam brought this halacha. Right? Nokem mechavero over below ta'aseh shenemar lo tikom. So a person, when he takes revenge, so he is in violation of the lo ta'aseh of lo tikom. The Rambam continues, Afa pi she'eno lokeh alav de'ah ra'ah hi ad me'od. So even though there is no punishment, there is no malkot with regard to lo tikom. We're going to talk about what is the Isser of lo tikom in just one moment, but there is no there's no Isur per se. The reason why it's understood that there isn't a malkot, there aren't lashes that are given to this lo taseh, is because it's considered to be a lav she'en bo ma'aseh. It's a lo ta'aseh that a person violates when there isn't an action that is done. My refraining from doing something is not necessarily an isur. Excuse me, it might be an isur, but there's no action. So we'll see the example that the Rambam gives in just one moment. Ela ra'ui lo la'adam liot ma'avir al midotav al kol divrei ha'olam sha'kol eitzel hamivinim divrei hevel v'havai ve'enan kedai linkom aleihem. So a person should be ma'avir al midotav. That's we speak about that in modern Hebrew as well. Ma'avir midotav means that he should basically get over his normal inclinations and rise above. We would say rise above yourself in this regard. Al kol divrei ha'olam, whatever it may be. Shahakol eitzel hamivinim divrei hevel, because ultimately, right, and maybe we have a better understanding of this kind of feeling during a crisis period like the one we're experiencing right now. Really, what do we normally get worked up over? Right? These things that we get worked up over are usually, when we look back at them, are divrei hevel v'havai. Right? They are elements which are really ultimately not too important. Ve'enan kedai linkom aleihem, and they are not worthy of being of revenging or avenging. Now, this regard, so what's the example that he gives? Keitzad hanikima, and we're going to see the source for this Rambam, or perhaps sources for this Rambam, as we go along in the next few moments. But this is the classic example. Rashi also gives this example because it's brought in the Gemara. It's the Sifrei. This is the example brought. Keitzad hanikima, amar lo chavero. So if your fellow asked, Hashileni kardumcha, amar lo eni mashilcha. So I went over to my neighbor. I needed an axe in the Rambam's example. Let's bring it up to modern times. My lawnmower isn't working, and I go over to my neighbor and ask him to borrow the lawnmower, and he says, "No, eini mashilcha. Sorry, I can't lend you my lawnmower." Lemachar, the following day, tzarich lishol mimenu, amar lo chavero hashileni kardumcha. So the next day, neighbor comes over and asks me for my lawnmower, or we'll make it a little bit, perhaps he says, "Oh, can I borrow your hedge trimmer? Amar lo, eini mashilcha kederech shelo hishaltani, kishasha'alti mimcha, harei ze noken. So I respond, well, when I needed a lawnmower, you weren't there for me. So you want my hedge trimmer? Go find it somewhere else. I'm not going to give you my hedge trimmer the same way you didn't give me your lawnmower. But rather, when he comes and asks him to borrow, so so the person should be much more gracious and give it. I repay a lack of favor by doing good. Halacha chet. So if I bear a grudge, similarly, I'm in violation. So what is the nitira? What is the difference between revenge and bearing the grudge? So Reuven asks Shimon to rent a home or to borrow an animal, and Shimon refuses. So again, the tables are turned a few days, years, whatever it is later. Amar lo Reuven, halacha hareini mashilcha ve'eni kamotcha, lo ashalem lecha kama'asecha, ha'osek kazeh over below titor. So if I say, well, of course I'll lend it to you. I'm not like you. You didn't give me anything, but I'm a nice guy. I'm a good person. So I'm going to give it to you. That's the Isur of Lo Titor. Now, the Rambam says here that that you should erase it from your heart and not bear the grudge. Now, this is an important, it's a subtle point that the Rambam is making. Let's say I give him the animal. I don't say anything, but I think it, right? In other words, he comes knocking on my door, and needs to borrow my hedge trimmer, and I give it to that person. And I don't think, I don't say to him, you're really a jerk, right? I needed a lawnmower last week, and you couldn't give me your lawnmower. I'm giving you my hedge trimmer anyway, because I'm better than you. But I think it. I don't say it, but I think it. Is that over the Isur of Lo Titor? So if I looked at the first three lines of the Rambam, so I might say no. In other words, if I don't rub his or her nose in it, so then I might not be over the Isur. But the Rambam says the expectation is Yimche Davar Min Libo, that I should erase it from my heart. V'lo yitrenu. Shekol zman shu noter et hadavar v'zochro shema yavo linkom. Because nitira is the step before nikima. Bearing the grudge is the step before taking revenge. So if that's the context, so I don't have to say anything. It's just if I'm thinking it. So if I'm thinking that, listen, I am a much better person than you are, so then the next time I might take revenge. So that's why the Torah tells us don't bear the grudge at all, and this is the basis for the din. And the Rambam concludes the halacha v'zohi hadeya nechona she'efshar she'yitkayim b'yishuv haaretz umasa'am umatanam shel bnei adam ze im ze. So this is the proper way of looking at things, which will allow for the proper functioning of society and the interaction between people. This is why the Rambam, as I said at the opening, the Rambam puts it in Hilchot Deyot. Right? This isn't it could have been found itself in Hilchot Nezikin, in Hilchot Geneva of some kind, Gezel, Nezek, whatever. In other words, the Rambam doesn't put it within the context of the halachot that are that are dealing with monetary matters of Chosh and Mishpat. The Rambam puts it within the category of Hamada, right? Sefer Mada, the first of the Sfarim of the Mishnah Torah, because this is character development, and this is the core of what a good society should be built upon. And these are not specific seifim in Hilchot Choshen Mishpat of civil law. This is something which is, if you will, civilization law. Okay, that's the idea of why the Rambam places it here, and he says that it, quite clearly that first of all it's very broad ranging. It's dealing with the sundry matters between individuals. There isn't any lo tikam. There isn't any major slight that's been made here, and this is the idea of lo tikam. If anything, if I take a look at the Rambam and I compare it to that first Ramban, originally when the Ramban, it's within the context of the parsha. So it started with lo tisnat achicha bilvavecha. There was an underlying rationale for why I would hate a person. Right? So maybe you'll say, well, you know what? People are so petty that if you go over to your neighbor and you ask her to borrow the lawnmower and she says no, right? So then people are so petty that they'll take that as a slight and they'll turn that. Next thing you know, it's we have the Romeo and Juliet story between different neighboring families. It all started, Hatfields and the McCoys all started because somebody didn't lend a lawnmower. Okay, maybe that's what happens. But I don't think so. There are times that people, we can all get over that kind of slight, at least on that level. We wouldn't say I hate the person, but that is that's the halachic ramifications and the halachic boundaries that are being set with regard to lo tikom and lo titor. Now, I just want to take one step back before I get a little bit more into detail on the halachic side, and just ask, why is it asur? We normally say that we talk about imitatio Dei. We talk about the idea of mimicking God and looking at his or her, its values and taking them upon myself. Mahu rachum afata rachum. Mahu chanun afata chanun. Why don't we say that Mahu nokem, right? God is the revenging God. Afata nokem. Right? Why don't we say, right, why is it, if there's nokem avon, if it's zocher avon avon? So if you remember the sin, the iniquities, so why shouldn't we do the same? Why shouldn't we bear the same kind of grudge? Why shouldn't we have that kind of nekama? And the Chizkuni has the following explanation. Chizkuni, the 13th century Parshan, French Parshan, strongly based on earlier Parshanim, but he says the following: Lo tikom lefi shahachema mechabashtcha, aval hakadosh baruch hu shehu kovesh et hachema ktiv nokem Hashem ubal chema. The question is, well, what's going to take over? I said before, where did the Hatfields and the McCoys begin? What started that family feud that took off? Where do all of these things begin? So maybe sometimes they begin with major slights, but other times they begin with minor things, and we allow the chema mechabashtcha, right? Our anger conquers us. The nature of human beings is that we let our emotions overcome us. God doesn't have that problem because hu kovesh et hachema, he's able to mete out punishment, call it revenge, call it what you will, but it's not being done out of anger. It's not being done out of proportion. So God is able to do that. We have a great deal of difficulty, if not impossibility, of in terms of drawing the line. So the Torah is saying lo tikom v'lo titor. If you're for us, we overcome our natural instincts at times by doing good, by being rachum, by being chanun, by giving up on my own personal interest in order to help another individual. When we are engaged in nikima and nitira, so then our focus is on ourselves. And when our focus is on ourselves, so then it's very difficult, if not impossible, to stop and to draw the line. So therefore, the Torah says, don't do it. So even though we have this idea of mahu rachum, we don't say by the same token, mahu nokem afata nokem. Now let's take a look at the halachic side of it. Because if I left the shir here, I think that there would be a legitimate question as to just call it how. Sorry for blanking out for a moment. How realistic is it that we are going to be doing this? Have this kind of attitude? Is there no time whatsoever, especially if I go back to what the Ramban said at the beginning? I have lo tisnat achicha bilvavecha. Somebody harmed me in a real way, cheated me. Not something, it's not that I asked him for the lawnmower. It's that we had a business deal, she was my partner, and she stole from the company. And now I'm being told, well, don't take any action. Almost along the lines of the Christian kind of concept. Turn the other cheek. Right? Is that what the Torah is expecting of me? Is there no time that I can't take steps to revenge myself? Right? If I've been harmed in some kind of way, there's no way that there's no recourse in the halachic system for that because of lo tikom and lo titor. So the Gemara in Yoma says the following: Amar Rabbi Yochanan mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Yotzadek, Kol tamid chacham she'eino nokem v'noter kinachash. Eino talmid chacham. Okay, now you take that. That is, think about it. Any talmid chacham who does not take a revenge, who does not bear a grudge like a snake, kinachash, eino talmid chacham, then that person isn't a talmid chacham, right? My guess is that there are plenty of people who might say, there are certain elements of being a talmid chacham that are beyond me. I can't grasp all of Shulchan Aruch and all of Shas. But to be nokem and noter k'nachash, that I can handle, right? I'll be a talmid chacham in that way, right? I'm sure there's some people who are like that, okay? But the statement here is to say that, that's what a talmid chacham is, somebody who, the imagery, think of like a cobra, just waiting to pounce and then snapping at the mongoose. That's the imagery that the Gemara wants us to see. That's the Talmid Chacham. So the Gemara says, that's really very interesting, but there is a pasuk, Haktiv lo tikom v'lo titor, right? What do you mean? there's a pasuk that says, don't take revenge. So the Gemara says, no, hahu bin mamon hu dichtiv. So that is with regard to monetary matters. Titania, ezohi nekima ve'ezohi netira. So there's a braita, and this is the braita that the Rambam referenced earlier. Nikima amar lo hashaleni magalcha amar lo lav. So I asked for the lawnmower, and he says no. L'machar amar lo hu hasieni kardumcha. The following day, he asked me for the hedge trimmer. Amar lo eni veshelcha keder shelo yishaltani zohi nekama. Right, the example that we just had. In other words, when it comes to these kind of monetary issues, that is where lo tikom v'lo titor. But if you're dealing with other types of issues, so then you're allowed to, and it's actually something which is laudable. No kem v'noter k'nachash. So the Gemara says, so what is that? Tzara de gufa lo. So it means, so that means if he's caused me pain, not that I've had some kind of monetary loss, but rather there is physical suffering or perhaps emotional suffering that he caused me. So that's what's left, and that's what the Talmid Chacham is allowed to and is expected to revenge. V'hatanya hane'elavin ve'inan ovin, shomin cherpatan ve'inan meshivin, osin me'ava usmechin b'yisurin. So those people who are insulted do not insult in return. Shomin cherpatan, they hear their shame being broadcast. Ve'inan meshivin, but they don't respond. Osin me'ava usmechin b'yisurin. They continue to work with love, and they are happy. They relish the suffering that they have. Aleina katuv omer v'ohavav ketzeit hashemesh b'gvurata. Right, the ones who love him, their strength is like the strength of the sun rising in the morning. So it's important here that even at this point, even though it's saying, listen, you're not going, how can you say a Talmid Chacham should respond? After all, we have this idea of Hane'elavin ve'inam ovin. Okay? It's already the Gemara has said that's not Nekima v'netira. Already the Gemara is saying that's not lo tikom v'lo titor. If you don't, it's not good character. Right? We want people ideally to be tzadikim. Ohavav k'tzeit hashemesh b'gvurata. If you want to say, I take a look at this person, I say, oh, this is the Chafetz Chaim. Right? This is a Mother Teresa type of figure if you want to talk about on the world stage. So then you could say, okay, that's who that person is, but the rest of the 7 billion of us aren't expected to be that way. So the Talmid Chacham is expected to be that way, and therefore he shouldn't respond when it comes to Tzar de Gufa either. But there's a strong implication here that this is not lo tikom v'lo titor if I do respond. Or it's important to stress that there's a gap between being a Rasha and not being a tzaddik olam. Right? Most of us are somewhere on that scale between being Risha'im on the one hand or being tzaddikim on the other. And of course, our goal in life is to keep ratcheting it up to get closer and closer to the tzidkut level. Okay? But that is something which is exactly that. It's tzidkut. It's not an isur if I failed in it. However, getting back to the Talmidei Chachamim who are expected to be doing this, la'olam dinakit le belibe. So the answer is that that you hold it in your heart. In other words, you don't necessarily do something about it, but we'll say you forgive, but you don't forget. Okay, that is that's the problem. V'ha'amar Rava kol ha'ma'avir al midotav ma'avirin lo al kol psha'av. So but doesn't Rava say, the Gemara keeps pushing it and says, isn't it true that if you can get over yourself and give up this grudge in your heart, then God in turn will forgive you for all of your sins? And the Gemara answers, no, the mefaisole umefayes. Now that only applies, mavirin la kol psha'at, is if that person came and apologized. If she apologizes to me, and even though, just because you said you're sorry, doesn't mean that everything is fine. Okay? That is something which is what we mean that you're supposed to give up on it. But here, if the person didn't come to me to apologize at all, so the Gemara says that Talmidei Chachamim are expected, then are expected to hold that on. Now, how do I take this Gemara and basically square the circle to the idea of lo tikom v'lo titor? Whereas I had this idea earlier of lo tikom v'lo titor, and it seemed to be very, very broad. To go back to what the Rambam said, the Rambam said very clearly that this idea is one where that as long as you hold anything in your heart, kol zman shu noteret hadavar v'zochro shema yavo linkom. So as long as it's in your heart, it's a time bomb that's just ticking along. So here the Gemara seems to be indicating that I can hold things in my heart, and that I can that I'm expected to hold them in my heart. So where does that come? How do I jive these two things together? The Chizkuni and the Ramban, getting back to the same Chizkuni, says the following. He says we'll see it first in terms of the context of the, if you will, the Parshanut, and then the Ramban's way of understanding it, lahalacha. He says, Yesh lomar shaharishon lo hiniach lashilo elamachmat saru. Let me take a step back. The Chizkuni asked a very important question. And it's something which, I guess you could think of it this way. Let's take the lawnmower hedge trimmer case, right? If I don't give the hedge trimmer after he didn't give the lawnmower, I'm over the Isur, right? Okay. What about him? I have a real reason why I didn't lend the hedge trimmer to him, right? Because he wasn't very nice to me. So maybe I should have gotten over that and I should have been super nice to him. But he didn't even have that excuse. Maybe last week when he came knocking on my door asking for the cup of sugar, I gave him the cup of sugar. And now I asked him for a favor and he turned me down. So I'm over the Isser. He's not over any Isser. Where does that come from? Right? So the Chizkuni is bothered by this type of question. Why should the person who responds be the one who is at fault, whereas the one who instigated the whole incident, he doesn't have any avera whatsoever? How could that be? So he says the following: Yesh lomar sharishon lo hiniach lahashilo el machmat sarut ayin shaya migalo chaviv alav ve'en hakadosh baruch hu machricho lahashil kelav shalom mirtzona. The reason why the Chizkuni says is because let's ask ourselves, what are the right of personal property? Do I have to lend things to other people? And the answer is no, I don't have to lend things to other people. If I have my property, so maybe, let's say when I went over to my neighbor and I asked him for the lawnmower, I don't know the whole story. It could be it's a brand new lawnmower. It could be that 2 weeks ago he lent out his car to someone and the car came back with a dent in the door. And he basically said, listen, I don't want to have to deal with these type of headaches. So I'm not going to lend out my things that could be damaged. Now, that doesn't make him a tzaddik necessarily, but it also doesn't make him a rasha. He has that right. He's not doing it out of stinginess. He's simply doing it out of self-interest. And we all have the right to self-interest. We all have the right to personal property. Right? So if that's the case, he didn't do anything wrong. Aval zeh, however, the second person, I would have lent it to him. I have this hedge trimmer. I have the gemach for hedge trimmers. And of course, I would lend it out to anyone in the neighborhood. But now I'm not going to lend it out to this person simply because he didn't do me the favor. Then that's the isur. In other words, if I'm doing it, what the nikama in of itself, if you will, is sort of neutral. The lack of doing favors is neutral. It's all a question of it's all the question of what the framework is and what the background is. So since this is within the context of sinah, he says, so then that's the isur. If there's no sinah that's involved, so then perhaps there isn't the isur. This is a little bit different than what the Ramban said at the beginning of the shir. The Ramban said that lo tikom v'lo titor is if I've already gotten over lo tisnat achicha bilvavecha. I don't hate him. It's just that I don't want to help him. Okay? That, the Ramban says, is the isur. The Chizkuni seems to say that might not be the case. Now, the Ramban continues this and says that with regard to Nikima and Nitira, so he says the following: Kvar pirshu rabotenu shehu b'davar she'ein bo chiyuv mamon. Now that word chiyuv, right, which here in the original text is in bold and in italics and underlined. So I'm going to highlight it too, right? So this is a very, very important word, chiyuv mamon. If I will keep coming back to that example of the lawnmower, there's no implication here that I could take him to court in any court of the world if a person doesn't want to lend me his his lawnmower. Right? There's no damages were done. Now it could be that my lawn looks terrible as a result, but again, there's no chiyuv, there was no obligation on his part to lend me the lawnmower. There was no breach of contract. However, he says, ki b'davar shenitchayev lo chavero mamon. If, on the other hand, you have a situation where there is a monetary obligation, kigon b'nizikenu chiyotze bahem. So if that person actively harmed my interest, right? It's not that he broke my lawnmower. It's not that he didn't lend me his lawnmower. He broke my lawnmower. Eino muchayav lahaniach lo. So there is no chiyuv to forgive that. Ella avayit be'enu bebeit din v'yishulam. So then the Ramban says, because you could look at it and say, if someone hurts my interest, my going to court is a form of revenge. The court might level fines against that person. There will be damages taken. So why am I not over the Isur of Lo Tikom? Because the Ramban says the Isur of Lo Tikom doesn't apply in cases of monetary loss. It only applies when a person didn't do a favor for you and your response is not to do a favor for them. That is the problem of Lo Tikom, the Lo Titor. And the Ramban doubles down on this idea. V'chol shechen b'inyan hanefesh. All the more so when it comes to affronts. And he gives the example, or this is of affront, which is where there actually is bodily harm. Ad sheyigal dmei achiv miyado. We have the concept of the goel hadam, the blood avenger. And the blood avenger is the person who is responsible to make sure that justice is served when things happen. So, you say someone doesn't not lend me a lawnmower. He kills my brother, and I'm supposed to say, okay, lo tikum, lo titor. I don't have to do anything, no problem, right? That's not what the Torah is expecting. So basically, what the Ramban is saying is that he has taken this idea of lo tikum lo titor from a much broader type of sense, and saying that in terms of the application, it's much narrower than we might have thought otherwise, right? To bring this home, there's this incredible tshuva of Rav Yitzchak Bar Sheshet, the Rivash, 14th century Spain, where he talks about the following case. I mean, it's like you read this, you can't believe it. He talks about a situation where this is mid tshuva. He has stepped down from the podium at a levaya, in which he had given a hesped to a certain chacham who had passed away. And he says, Achar suyumi, after I finished my hesped, after I finished my eulogy, patach Iyov et piho vayikalel. Right? Iyov opened up his mouth and he cursed. It's a paraphrase on Iyov staying quiet, and this Job, so he opened up and he cursed. And he mentions by name who this person was, who Rav Yitzchak Bunstrok. Okay, this Rav Yitzchak Bunstrok, he was a person who was the next Satan. He was the next eulogizer on the ticket. Hitchila drosh. So this is what he began to say. V'amar shenifrain min hasapadin she'omrim alamed divrei shevach she'ein bahem. He introduced his hesped by saying that ultimately God will, a person who gives a eulogy which isn't deserved and heaps false praise upon the dead, right, will have to give an accounting to his maker. It's me'idin edut sheker lifnei Hashem. It's as though he is giving false testimony. Right? He basically gets up there and he says, I have come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. And with that, he launched off on an attack on the character of the person who had passed away, and said how he had wronged him in his life, meaning the niftar had wronged Rav Yitzchak in his life, and he even topped it off that it must be it's interesting in the tshuva. The Rivash writes, "Hayad datenu latzet mi bet hakneset be'emtza dvarav." I and other people around me wanted to get up and walk out of the shul while he was speaking, because this is just unacceptable. But but we stuck around hoping against hope that he would say something nice. But he didn't. He said, listen, I'm sure, this is the backhanded praise that he gave. And it was apparently a chacham who he was eulogizing. He said, I'm sure, he said, I'm sure that when he was on his deathbed, he must have said vidui for the terrible things that he did against me in his life. Because I'm sure he didn't want to go to meet God with this on his conscience. And therefore, I want everyone to know that regardless of all the terrible things that he did to me in his lifetime, I'm forgiving him, right? And then he sat down. That was the end of the eulogy. Okay, you can imagine being at that kind of levaya, what happened. So the Rivash is scandalized, and he says the following, that so he says, Omnam, im krovei hachacham, nachat eden, right? If the nun ayin is the equivalent of zichrono livracha, okay, that he is resting in heaven. If the relatives of this person, of this chacham, yirivehu v'yisne'ehu alzeh, so if they, right, you could see all of the relevance, the relatives just aghast at what they just heard. Hadin imahem. The halacha is they're allowed to hate this individual. Ki me'olam lo shamati nevela kaza. I've never heard something so scandalous. Afilu al kal shebekalim atalin chume tzuure mitzarinai. Right? His role was to comfort, and he just caused grief, okay, to the people. So this is taking it even maybe even a little bit further than the Ramban did, and he's saying that when it comes to real egregious personal affront, we're not expected to turn the other cheek. Nikama and lo tittor is within the context of, if you will, character development. And if I haven't been hurt, I'm not then I'm expected not to, if you will, deepen the cycle of enmity. I'm supposed to break it. If I've been hurt, so I may have it might be a good thing for me to, going back to the Gemara and Yoma, saying that I should be along the lines of those tzaddikim, but it's not something which I'm necessarily expected to do, or if I violate it, I'm over the isur. But that I have to tell you, that doesn't sound like the Rambam. The Rambam didn't make the distinction. The Rambam ignored the Gemara in Yoma. He didn't describe how, in cases of monetary loss, I have the right to take revenge. He says, in a very categorical type of way, and as I said earlier, it's in Hilchot Deyot, it's in the question of the halachot of character development. So there, the Rambam talks about very, very clearly that all forms of nikama, all forms of nitira, all forms of revenge or bearing a grudge, all of these things are usher. The Rambam doesn't make that distinction. What does the Rambam do with the Gemara? Why doesn't the Rambam agree with it? So here, the Rambam, I believe the answer lies in what is the proper nusach for that Gemara. This nusach is found in the source of the Gemara and the Midrash Sifra, the Midrash Halacha on Sefer Vayikra and Parshat Kedoshim. It's found in some of the manuscripts within the Gemara itself, and it's quite possible that this was the nusach that the Rambam had. Number 11, Lo Tikom, Ad Hechan Hi Kocha Shel Nikima. Until what point is the strength of revenge? Amar lo heshileni malgalcha v'lo hishilcha lemachar amar lo heshileni kardumcha. So then it gives the example, the lawnmower hedge trimmer example. Now, those two words, ad hecha, okay, those two words are so critical. Later on in lo titor, again, ad hecha, till what point? In other words, by adding those two words of ad hechan, what the Midrash is doing is saying this is not the example, but rather this is the extreme example. Whereas it's understood that if I have been truly slighted and hurt, I have to get over that. That's lo tisnat achicha bilvavecha. Right? We have to break the cycle of enmity. But what about something as trivial as a favor not done? I'm not bearing any enmity, right? Okay, you don't want to be my friend. I won't be your friend. That's basically all that's happening. So I might think that's not included in lo titor at all. That's not bearing a grudge. I'm simply saying, listen, I can read the social cues. You don't like me. Okay, you don't have to like me. And I don't have to be your friend either. That's all that it is. And the Torah wants to say that's not all that it is. That's the extent that I'm expected to be ma'avir al midotai. That's the extent that I'm expected to swallow my pride a little bit and try to be kind even when people aren't kind to me. That's lo tikom v'lo titor. And that's where the Rambam might be getting into. That's why the Rambam is saying that in that line that we read earlier on, the zehu adeya nechona she'efshar sheyitkayem b'yishuv haaretz u'masa'am u'matanam shel bnei adam ze im ze. The final line that the Rambam ended the halacha with. That this is the proper kind of conduct that we're supposed to have one with the other, even in situations which in any normal, I call it normal, if you will, if I were to go into the outside world and say, is this nikima, is this revenge, right? Think about it, the vengeance is mine and I won't give you my hedge trimmer. That's not exactly how it works, right? Vengeance is, revenge, as we all know, is a dish best served cold, right? That's not what we're talking about when we talk about you didn't invite me to your party, I'm not going to invite you to my party, right? That's but the Torah is saying you don't have to wait to have something which will make great literature or a good movie to reach the point where you're over lo tikom v'lo titor. Even in the minor trivial interactions between human beings, that's lo tikom v'lo titor. That's something that you have to be very careful about. As I said, now, what would the Rambam say about those other situations? That the case of the Rivash. What about the idea of the Talmid Chacham? So here the Ritva, and maybe this is something that the Rambam would be forced to say. The Ritva in his reading of the Gemara says, Af agav the ktiv lo tikom v'lo titor, even though it says, do not take revenge, do not bear a grudge. Hatam b'mile da'alma. When is it forbidden? That's in things that are happening in the world itself. Aval b'mile d'shemaya ibai leliot nokem v'noter. A Talmid Chacham has to distinguish between his own personal interests and, if you will, the interests of the community, the interests of God. Milei d'shemaya. The only time the Ritva says that revenge is considered to be laudable is if it's not your honor that's at stake, but rather a higher value that's at stake. Then, if you will, it's on principle, then you can do it. Now, to make that distinction is very, very, very difficult, right? All too often, right, we'll step back and we'll say, what is my interest is the higher principle, right? We're blinded by our own self-interest, and we think that what's going on is that God has been offended in some kind of way, but it's not really God at all. It's just me, right? If you will, what I like to call the Sussman-centric view of the universe. Okay, we all have that, right? That we are in the center of the universe, and it must be that God's pretty upset too. To make that distinction, right, is not easy, but the distinction is a legitimate distinction. That's where the Talmid Chacham is allowed or even expected to strike back like the snake. But in everything else, lo tikom v'lo titor. The Ramban's approach was more that it's in areas where there's been real blank out again. When there's been real attack against an interest of mine, I have a violation of my interest. So then I have the right, perhaps even the obligation, to respond. The just to leave, we started a little bit late, which is why I'm going overtime here. Just 2 more minutes, please bear with me. I'll just end with the words of the Chafetz Chaim and then the words of the Nitziv. The Chafetz Chaim here says in his the Be'er Mayim Chayim, the Hilchot Lashon Hara, it's not as famous as some of his other works, but he asks the following. He talks about, well, when are you going to be over the Isur and not? He says that he viewed Hayotze midvarenu. I'm just going to go, please read the entire quote afterwards, but I'm just going to take the bottom line, literally. Hayotze midvarenu. The conclusion that one can draw from what I'm saying now. Im tziaru tzara de gufa. If a person was harmed personally, bodily, perhaps whether it's psychologically, whether it's physically, whether it's monetarily, machloket ben harishonim. So there turns out that it's an argument between the Rishonim, between what I think is the Rambam on the one hand and the Ramban on the other. Im mutar min haTorah linkom mimeno. So it becomes a machloket. Bisfeika deoraita l'chumra. So when I have a machloket between Rishonim as to what is the Isur, and it's a din deoraita, it's a Torah precept, so the basic rule is always Sveika deoraita l'chumra. I always say that when I should be erring on the side of caution, and that is therefore I have to be extra careful. There might be those who say, well, to be machmir, I should be machmir and take revenge. I don't know if that's what the Chafetz Chaim meant. I don't think so. But if it's monetary, so then it's forbidden. Now, as I said, the Ramban might disagree. If going to court is not considered to be revenge, but basically taking actions to protect yourself wouldn't be considered to be revenge, but taking punitive measures, perhaps that would, at least according to the Chafetz Chaim. And I'll close with the words of the Nitziv, because ultimately, and I think that all of the Dayot would agree with this, whether or not we disagree on the particular detail of when a certain action may be halachically permissible or forbidden. So the Nitziv in his commentary to Lo Tkom says it just very simply. Nikama eina midah hakdosha b'Yisrael. Revenge is not a character trait that is going to lend to the point of a person being kiddoshim tihiyu. Getting back to the beginning of this year. The whole point of these mitzvot at the beginning of Parshat Kedoshim, that idea of Rabbi Levi, is that we are taking the precepts of the Aseret HaDibrot. We're taking concepts that are carved in stone, and we're turning them into living, breathing concepts that are carved into our hearts. And those concepts that are carved into our hearts are reaching to the point, that impossible point, the way that the Ramban said, but nevertheless, that's what we're striving for, to reach the V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. And even if there might be situations where nikama is permissible, it's not a midah kdosha b'Yisrael. It's not something which is going to further the goal of kedusha. And so therefore, I have the obligation to try to stop and break the cycle. And with this, he says the following: Hadavar muvan, and with this we'll close. Shehu mishum sha'asalo ra'a mishum hachi meshiv lo ra'a. It's understood. Normally, when people do things that are wrong to me, I wrong them in return. Aval hu tachat tova shayta oseh lo lasot she'im haya oseh tova haya nishpat midanim. We all know this and we all say it, but it has to be said and really felt. the best way to break a cycle of enmity is to do good. If you respond not in kind, not even lo titor in the sense of not doing something, but doing something in a positive way to break the cycle, so then that is the best recipe for getting back to what the Rambam had said of creating a society, right? This is the society that we strive for, and ultimately we want the society to be a society which is not based on Taqum v'Tittor, and we don't really look at our Talmidei Chachamim as notrim kinachash, but rather as Kedoshim Tihiyu, Ki Kadosh Ani Hashem Elokecha. Have a wonderful Shabbat, and it was wonderful to not to hear you, right? I look forward to joining with you again in the shiur in person and being able to hear all your comments and not people being muted. I hope everyone is well, and have a wonderful Shabbat.
שנייה, רב יהודה?
Yes.
כן, אנחנו פתאום לא שומעים אותך.
אמרתי שלום.
אוקיי.
אוקיי, אבל בסדר, סיימתי את השיעור.
שנייה, לא הבנתי. אתה סיימת את השיעור, נכון?
כן.